All right, so my talk for today, Black Queer Poetics, Affirming Spirit, Self, and Sexuality, is part of a larger project, which is, one that has been developing in a lot of ways for many years at this point. So back in 2010, in January of 2010, I developed and introduced a new undergraduate course titled Voice and Visibility, African Americans and the Power of Spoken Word. And I'm going to take a moment and say that one of my former students who was in that course at Hampshire College is now working on her PhD at UJ, and she came today. So there's a little bit of full circle. I'll try not to embarrass myself in front of her. Right. But this was a course that I started teaching in a Jan term in 2010, which was one of these sessions that lasted for about 3 weeks. I think we met 12 times. And so I started out with this course thinking that I wanted to do something that would be easily digestible for us to do a full semester's worth of material within 3 weeks. And I thought to myself, okay, we'll do spoken word. It's easy. The students will probably do the reading overnight because they're not going to be that long, and we'll be able to kind of move through a number of different themes and ideas, right? And so at the time, I primarily used Def Poetry Jam clips and what was available on YouTube. And this was a few years ago. YouTube was nowhere near as extensive as it is now. But what I was able to do was to pull together this course that had two primary objectives. The first was to expose students to a broad range of what the Black oral tradition really was, right? So we started off talking about West African tale tellers. We moved our way through the Black diaspora, focusing primarily on African Americans. We looked at the preacher, we looked at the blues, we looked at jazz, we looked at these various different artistic and oral traditions moving throughout primarily 20th century, right? So that was kind of objective number one, was to think about the Black oral tradition kind of writ large, right? Objective number two was to think about how we can look at contemporary spoken word poets along with hip hop artists, along with the kind of voices in the contemporary moment, and think about how younger, newer artists were conceptualizing Blackness and were thinking about a range of different issues that were tied to their identity, right? And so at the time, again, I was using Def Poetry Jam and I was using YouTube clips for what was available. And while I found myself very easily coming up with videos and sources to deal with critiques of America, to deal with the reality of urban life, to deal with intracommunal and intercommunal violence, to talk about a whole wide range of issues, I found myself constantly struggling to find artists who were talking about sexuality, right? And so this is not to say, of course, that Black queer poets are a new thing, because they're not, but the idea of looking through kind of these popular venues was not finding it for me. And so instead what I would do is I would come across kind of small, out-of-the-way poets from coffee houses and from local slams, right, that finally maybe made their way onto YouTube. And even then, what I found is that most of those poets who were willing to engage with sexuality or engaged with a nuanced understanding of gender happened to be women poets. And I was always struggling to find Black male poets who had reached that kind of popularity, right? So a lot of this kind of started to change the year after, which is when HBO came out with Brave New Voices, right? And so in that kind of collection of younger poets, I found that there were more and more young men of color who were willing to engage with an expanded understanding of sexuality and who were able to work it into their poetry and to really kind of think through this. And so I go through all this backstory as a way of thinking about how I kind of got into this project, which in a larger way is about looking at how these younger poets, primarily in their teens and in their 20s, are thinking about their Blackness and are thinking about their identity in more complicated ways than even the kind of poets who were popular in the spoken word scene 5 or 10 years ago. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, I'm really good with call and response. We're going to talk about that as well. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, excellent. And so this is kind of where I started with this particular project. And so I combined my interest with spoken word poetry with what is kind of my long-range interest in thinking about the relationship between Black expressive traditions and the church, right? Thinking about religion, thinking about spirituality, thinking about the institution of the church as a political, cultural space, and thinking about the ways in which various different artistic traditions. I'm primarily a literature scholar, but I look at music, I look at kind of art, I look at these various different ways in which creative articulation and expression are rooted in Black spirituality, right? And so as I made my way through both spoken word and thinking about those artists who are really looking at religion and spirituality in some interesting ways, I kind of became enamored with this poet, Danez Smith, who is an amazing poet. Is anybody familiar with him? Okay, just a couple. You all will thank me later. You want to thank me now or you want to wait? Okay, you'll thank me later. We'll wait. Okay, I appreciate your optimism. All right, so this is a young poet who is currently, I want to say Danez is 26, maybe 27, and he's a Cave Canem Fellow, two-time Pushcart nominee, and their published work includes their 2014 debut collection, Insert Boy, which was honored with the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Poetry and the Kate Tufts Discovery Award. Their second collection, Don't Call Us Dead, is coming out next year with Grey Wolf Press, right? And so I'll take a moment and say that I'm going to kind of be flexible with my pronouns when I talk about Danez throughout the remainder of the presentation, because often Danez prefers the gender-neutral pronouns of they and their, right? But I recently brought them to campus, to Gettysburg, as a part of a spoken word series that we hosted this semester. And I had been working with my students to be really very careful and very thoughtful about pronouns. And one of my students said he, and I corrected her. And Danez is like, oh no, he is fine. It's perfectly, like, it's not a big thing. And so there's a way that he, they, embraces a very clear gender fluidity. One of the poems that they performed when they were here, which I don't think is actually available on YouTube yet because it's a fairly new poem, he actually starts off by saying, if I had a gender, it would be 90s R&B video, right? And so there's a really very interesting way that he kind of creates Unbreak My Heart and all these things. It's great stuff. But there's a real careful gender fluidity. And so I say that because in general I'm going to try to stick with they, but there are some direct quotes where they refer to themselves as male, use man, and use he. And so I may be flipping back and forth, but I just wanted to take a moment to clarify that, right? And so while I'm going to be thinking about what Danez is doing with their work in print, I'm also really particularly focused on their spoken word poetry output, right? And so Danez has been building a following and has been gaining greater and greater popularity with an online presence which goes back to about 2011 through personal poetry, personal websites, poetry blogs, BuzzFeed, YouTube, right, is really where they're building a broader and broader audience, even as they are still working on publishing poetry in some really, well-regarded presses, right? They're finishing their MFA currently, and so they're working through the kind of traditional poetry landscape, but I really want to focus for today and also within my kind of broader project on spoken word. And so I'm thinking about spoken word for a couple of different reasons, right? So for one of the reasons beyond my kind of interest in this course, which originally started, was in thinking about how spoken word is part of an African diasporan sensibility, which recognizes the generative power and spiritual weight of utterance, and an African cultural legacy that privileges the power of the spoken word. Right? So Jan Hans Jan in Muntu, an outline of the new African culture, it's an old book, but a good one, right? Explains this significance of language in terms of the prominent Dogon cultural concept of nomo. He writes, quote, "Nomo is water, and the glow of fire and seed and word in one. Nomo, the life force, is a unity of spiritual physical fluidity, giving life to everything, penetrating everything, causing everything. And since man has power over the word, it is he who directs the life force. Through the word he receives it, shares it with other beings, and so fulfills the meaning of life." Jan concludes that, quote, "All the activities of men and all the movement in nature rest on the word, on the productive power of the word, which is water and heat and seed and nomo, that is life force itself," end quote. All right, and so I think about this concept of language power as a very important diasporan sensibility, which we're tracing back to kind of a West African spiritual, cultural, and ethical consciousness, right? And also thinking about Philip Peake, who has an essay that you all should read. It's called "The Power of Words in African Verbal Arts." And I really think that this essay is important for me because I am really focused on the idea of spoken word poetry as the latest incarnation of verbal arts and what that terminology really means and what it encompasses, right? So Peake examines the significance of language skill, incorporating a range of societies into his discussion, including the Yoruba and the Igbo of Western Africa, as well as the Isoko of the Niger Delta and the Burundi of Central Africa, right? While the particularities of each society differ, Peake describes speech and sound as being, quote, frequently conceived of as a tangible entity, which defines individual presence and allows human interaction. Peake also describes sound as, quote, the auditory space perceived as a physical field, and argues that of great significance in daily life for many is the equation of words and actions, the understanding that words, even thoughts, are in themselves actions, right? And so thinking about what Peake is doing and what Jan is doing and talking about the power of words, for me it's not just this kind of idea that, you know, words are consequential, right? That words mean something, but it's a way of engaging with the power of speech and the power of utterance, which is rooted in something more than just, oh, I just think words are impactful, right? But there's a real spiritual foundation and a spiritual sensibility that is at work here, right? And in a lot of ways, I think that this is important for us to consider as we move into thinking about the ways that West African spirituality comes into contact with Judeo-Christianity. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move forward, right? But, you know, I don't know how many other Southern Baptists are in the room if it's just me, right? But there's a way that we can think about the idea of words embodying power, whether we want to talk about, you know, the creation narrative and the idea of a God that speaks the world into being by saying, let there be light, or that we want to talk about kind of New Testament conceptions, right? I am the vine, ye are the branches, let your words abide in me, right? There's a real understanding that is deeper than just, oh, words have meaning, right? But that's rooted in something else. And we'll talk about that more as we move on, right? And so for one, it's the idea of utterance, right, as spiritually consequential. The other reason that I like to think about spoken word poetry in different ways than when we talk about the kind of page poetry or that exists, right, in print, is to think about the idea that spoken word is not just about like speaking, but it's also about a certain degree of performativity, right? And so there are ways in which the body becomes a part of this performance as well. And so for this, I kind of lean back on E. Patrick Johnson, right, who has done a lot of work in Black queer studies, a lot of work in, you know, performance studies. But in the midst of all of that, one of the kind of theoretical frameworks that Johnson puts forth is the idea of queer studies. You guys familiar with queer studies? A little bit, I see a couple of heads, right? So basically what queer studies is, and this is a very rudimentary, like crass explanation, I apologize, right, that it's not deeper than that, but we're gonna keep moving because we're eating lunch, right? So queer studies is primarily the idea of kind of a mirroring of like womanist studies, right, which really deals with feminism in a more intersectional way, right? So queer studies is a field of thought that's really about engaging with queerness, but it's also about incorporating Blackness and giving it a little more dimension and thinking about the kind of ways in which race and sexuality intersect, right? And so it gets far more complicated beyond that, but ultimately that's kind of what queer studies is in a nutshell, right? And so with this, Johnson talks about queer studies as one of the, what he calls, or what he's advancing from Ansel Dua and a few others, the idea of a theory in the flesh, right? He explains that, quote, theories in the flesh emphasize the diversity within and among gays, bisexuals, lesbians, and transgendered people of color, while simultaneously accounting for how racism and classism affect how we experience and theorize the world, right? He says, we conjoin theory and practice through an embodied politics of resistance. This politics of resistance is manifest in vernacular traditions such as performance, folklore, literature, and verbal art, right? And so I want us to remember, here comes that verbal art terminology again, right, which we've been looking at going all the way back to Peake, right? So now there's a way in which I'm a little hesitant to use the terminology queer, primarily because Danez identifies as queer, and I try to honor what people identify as, which is why my title is Black Queer Poetics and not queer, right? But I do think that there is something valuable about the way that Johnson kind of maps out this idea of queer studies with regard to performance and with regard to kind of theory in the flesh, but particularly this emphasis on embodied resistance, right? And so I'm going to read a lengthier quote from Johnson where he talks about the role of these embodied politics of resistance within vernacular traditions, right? So Vernacular traditions that emerged among enslaved Africans, including folk tales, spirituals, and the blues, provided the foundation for social and political empowerment. These discursively mediated forms, spoken and filtered through Black bodies, enabled survival. Although they had no institutional power, enslaved Blacks refused to become helpless victims and instead enacted their agency by cultivating discursive weapons based on an identity as oppressed people. The result was the creation of folk tales about the bottom rail becoming the top riser, or spirituals that called folks to gather at the river, or these resistant vernacular performances did not disappear with slavery. Gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgendered people of color continued to enact performative agency to work on and against oppressive systems. Now, there's a lot going on there, but what I'm going to zoom in on, right, whether we're talking about this embodied politics of resistance or these kind of resistant vernacular practices, is the very idea of resistance, right? So this is kind of at the core of where we're going from here, right? Even though there's a whole lot more that we could talk about in these kind of vernacular traditions as he's moving through these various different kind of elements of this cultural legacy that I think spoken word is just the most current manifestation of. Right? And so as he's talking about this idea of resistance against these institutions and these spaces that would seek to oppress Black queer bodies, right? It leads me back to thinking about Danez and to thinking about these spoken word poets that are kind of the subject of our conversation today, right? And thinking about this act of resistance against institutions that would seek to marginalize or disembody or render these Black queer folks silent, we're going to have to talk about the Black church, folks. This is where we're going, right? And so when I think about the Black church, right, in my own complicated relationship, and many folks have complicated relationships, we don't have to get into all of that right now. We'll do the therapy session during Q&A. But the idea, and I want to start off by being very, very clear, right? That when I talk about the Black church, I'm basically doing this just for ease. As I said, it's lunchtime. We have a condensed time. We don't have time to really talk about all the diversity within the Black church. I don't mean to suggest that the church is monolithic any more than Black people are monolithic, right? But when I'm thinking about, or the way that I'm talking about the Black church, I'm primarily focused on the traditional Black church, those with a fundamentalist reading, those with a literalist reading of the Bible, right? Those that are invested in a language that deems homosexuality as inherently sinful, right? In their most hostile ways, deeming homosexuality as inherently sinful, in the more, loving and more gentle way, embracing the rhetoric of, we hate the sinner, we hate the sin, Freudian slip. We hate the sin, but we love the sinner, right? And so there are ways in which we can think about how these, Black queer figures and subjects are working to kind of navigate this space, where they're either working to keep their sexuality, completely silent and hidden in order to be able to move throughout the, the church space, or to find ways of divorcing themselves from that sexuality in order to exist within that space, right? The idea that, well, I'm beloved in this community, I'm appreciated in this community, but my sexuality just can't be a part of this, right? And so there are those who have been talking about the Black church, and I forget who it is, so I apologize for not citing my source right now, but there was an article I read once which summed it up beautifully, which talked about the idea that the Black church perfected don't ask, don't tell long before the military even did, right? And so this idea that, well, we love the sinner, we'll join you in the choir, we'll, hug on you with your mama, but we still need to kind of talk about, or not talk about, the other parts of you that we can't really engage here, right? And so when we think about this, it leads me again back to Danez, right? And in talking about this kind of emotionally fraught and often psychologically damaging space, which kind of requires Black queer folks to remain fractured as a way of existing within this church space, which is nurturing in some ways and utterly oppressive in others, right? And so in Smith's first website, there's a biography in which they describe themselves as, quote, a young artist walking and writing in the footsteps of Baldwin and Hughes, who seeks to continue to be a voice for hushed choir boys, the walking shadows, the joy, hurt, and journey of the Black queer men. Right? So reflecting upon their own childhood, Smith acknowledges a complicated relationship with the church, challenging the presence of, quote, the practice, of, quote, a strict, devout, unquestioning relationship with God, Danez rejects the harmful ideologies presented by extremists of every religion. That's a direct quote. Right? They also recognize their complex relationship with, quote, Black Pentecostal and Kojic and Baptist traditions, acknowledging that, quote, being queer, I think of church as a very nurturing but also violent space in my own personal history. All right. Danez goes on to explain that the church is, quote, definitely a safer space for a particular kind of Blackness and Black bodies, but it's also brought me much fear and confusion and sadness and depression and anguish during my life as well, end quote. Smith concludes pointedly, quote, it's more of an abusive relationship than anything, my relationship to the church and to religion, right, end quote. So now I look at the ways that Smith is working to negotiate the church as an institution that has both sustained and suffocated them, right? Representing an affirmation of their Blackness as well as an affront to their queerness, right? And so as we think about this, I'm engaged with this question of vernacular resistance, right? And thinking about the ways that Smith is using, as much as they're kind of negotiating the church, they're also using the elements of the Black worship tradition are infused in their work, right? Whether we're talking about gospel music, whether we're talking about the spirituals, whether we're talking about their sermon forms, right? All of these various different forms that are about coming out of the church are so present in the work, even as the work is working against, right, the more oppressive elements of the church. Does this make sense? Yeah? Okay. And so this is, again, a direct quote, right? And I'm sorry, I'm giving you guys a lot of direct quotes because I'm very excited about the fact that I have direct quotes because I've actually talked with Nez and doing these interviews. Just for the record, I love James Baldwin. I've been studying Baldwin for years, but I cannot for the life of me get him on the phone, right? And so I get very excited when I'm working with these contemporary figures and I'm like, I can actually call you up and talk about stuff. So there's gonna be a lot of direct quotes, so just bear with me, right? And so Smith reflects upon testimony and preaching as, quote, the first poetry I ever encountered. And so it's what comes most naturally for me, I think, seeing people testify and the beauty in the language and the rawness of that. I think that manifests itself a lot in my poetics, right? And so this is kind of where we're going to focus on today. Again, like I said, if you move through Danez's work, you'll find elements of the blues, but you'll also find elements of gospel music, the spirituals, all of these other different worship forms. But my focus today is going to be on testimony. All right, and so testimony, the public sharing of one's personal journey, has long been a central element of the Black worship experience. The oft-leading declaration, I just couldn't keep it to myself, suggests that testimony is a story that simply needs to be told, and perhaps more importantly, needs to be heard. Testimonies are delivered in order to speak to common experiences, which is why you'll hear things like, I know somebody knows what I'm talking about today, right? As well as to affirm the uniqueness of an individual's story, you can't tell it like I tell it. Right? Through the personal testimony, one's unique experience and individual walk of faith becomes part of the congregation's shared reality. Beyond the articulation of one's personal narrative, the testimony also solidifies the relationship between individual and congregation. When one stands before the altar, they affirm themselves as part of the community of the faithful and offer fellow worshipers the most intimate details of their life with an expectation of support rather than judgment. Right? And so I think about testimony in kind of three different ways, right? So a congregant who stands before their church family to publicly confess and pronounce their contrition seeks forgiveness as a crucial part of the process of healing and moving forward from whatever wrongs they have done. At their lowest moment, in the midst of struggle, they might acknowledge their despair in the form of a prayer request, calling upon the corporate power of intercessory prayer, seeking deliverance from their current trials. The testimony of praise, or a praise report, functions to report survival, to declare the goodness of God and divine triumph over one's proverbial storm. Although the testimony is ostensibly the most accessible of the expressive traditions, requiring neither skills nor special standing to be delivered, the morality and respectability politics of the church do establish clear, if unspoken, limitations on whose testimony is valued. The apologetic confession is reserved only for those who recognize their behavior as sinful and therefore agree to turn from their wicked ways. The prayer request, similarly, is available only to those who seek to be delivered from whatever struggle has ensnared them, right? And here I'm going to go to an example. How many of you all have heard of Andrew Caldwell? Right? And so I'm not sure if the clicker works with this. It doesn't, so we're going to go back. All right, I'm going to use the mouse here. We'll play it, and then we'll talk about Andrew.
do, he just told you it's done right now. What did you come here for? What did you come down here for? Tell me.
To get delivered more.
To get delivered. Do you believe that the Lord tonight has set you free?
Yes, sir.
Turn around and tell those people.
Tell them. I'm not gay no more.
I am delivered. I don't like men no more. I said I like women. Women. I said women. I'm not gay. I would not date a man. I would not tear a purse. I would not put on makeup. I will love a woman. Now, listen, y'all praise God with him. Hold on, wait a minute. Hold just 1 minute. Now, either you gonna believe this stuff or you ought to stop preaching it. If you can't praise God with him, you're an unbeliever. Now, somebody believe God with him.
I'm not gay no more.
Okay, so now, some of you all maybe didn't recognize the name, but maybe you've seen the face before, you've seen the clip, right? And so, Caldwell, famously known as, you know, I don't like men's no more, right? Quickly became this internet meme, right? The video went viral, it went on Vine, right? There's all these memes that are going around where he becomes like this public laughingstock, right? Folks are making fun of him, folks are calling him a fraud, right? There's so much going on in that clip, like that minute-long clip. We don't even have time to unpack all of it, but we're gonna talk a little bit about it, right? And so there's a way in which, despite the fact that this becomes this huge meme and Caldwell becomes this face of ridicule, people are mocking him, right? There's something deeply painful about this entire thing, right? That this is in a lot of ways emblematic of that desire to rid yourself of this sexuality as inherently sinful contaminant within a fundamentalist church space, right? And so there's, on the one hand, we can talk about Caldwell, right? And we will. Right? But then there's also something really important about this preacher's moment after, where he says, wait, don't laugh, right? Because if you don't believe this, then you should stop preaching it, right? And so there's this way that Caldwell becomes a symbol of this fraud, that clearly he's still gay. Nobody can just shirk it that way. That just doesn't work, and people are mocking him. And now, to be fair, he did embrace the fame quite a bit. Like, he's going on Jimmy Kimmel. Like, he's really kind of, you know, he feeds into this frenzy to a degree, right? But there's also a way that in the laughter and in the ridicule, right, folks are betraying their own sensibilities because they're saying that, no, you don't just shirk your sexuality like that. It doesn't happen, right? Which is why you have to think about how deeply conflicting that is, that we both say it's a sin and then we say, but you can't just turn it off and on. So, like, we have to reconcile with that a bit, right? But I look at Caldwell as a prime example of this idea that the testimony is only available to you if you are willing to say, I want to be delivered from it, if you're willing to apologize for it, or if you're going to praise, like he praises at the end, because you've been delivered from it, right? And so we can look at Caldwell, we can look at other figures like Donnie McClurkin, right, who was very famously ex-gay, right? And he, you know, is very publicly spoken about his struggle with sexuality, right? But I've been delivered, but I've had backsliding moments, but I'm trying to work my way through, right? And so there is this idea that you can confess, you can apologize, you can look for help, right? But if you don't see your sexuality as a sin or as a struggle, you don't get to have a testimony of praise. Everybody understand where I'm going with this? Yeah? Okay. We're not going to spend that much time on Caldwell because you guys have good poetry coming and you'll thank me for it, right? And so what ends up happening then, right, is if we're going to look at the ways in which Black queer voices can engage a testimony of praise, then you have to move beyond the space of the church, right? Which is why we start looking at the arts, why we start looking at these communal spaces, why we start looking at alternate ways of thinking about how your personal autobiography, your personal journey can gain voice in a way that won't be ridiculed, that won't be dismissed, that will be celebrated, right? And so we move beyond the church in order to do that, which is what leads me to conversation today, which is, that doesn't really mean anything. It was just a really cool image of spoken word, and so I put it up there, right? But the idea of how Danez Smith uses the spoken word space as a space to offer testimony, right? And as a space to engage with their audience as a congregation and engage with a kind of sacredness about what happens outside of the church space, right? And so for Smith, again, direct quote, "What is important to me is to not take the identity of the author out. I'm not about the idea of, quote, the speaker. It's me. It's important that I wrote this. A queer man wrote those black poems. A black man wrote those queer poems. I want to move in the traditions of those communities where they intersect and where they do not, but I also want them to reconcile whatever they have against one another in these poems, because I've already reconciled with them. I mean, I want to feel the tension between a Judeo-Christian Southern blackness and a radical queerness in my body and my body of work. And sometimes I just want to let that tension fall and be free." And so that's the end quote, right? For Smith, poetic testimony claims power over personal narrative, intentionally doing so beyond the walls of any church where their audience becomes a congregation and the stage and the microphone are claimed as a poetic pulpit, right? And so the poem that I want to focus on today is called Genealogy, right? So I'll go ahead and play it and then we'll discuss it.
And on the 8th day, God said, "Let there be fierce." And that's the story of the first snap. The hand's humble attempt at thunder, a small sky troubled by attitude. And on the 9th day, God said, "Bitch, work." And Adam learned to duck walk, dip, pose, death drop. Eve became the fruit herself, looked the lion in the eye, and dared the king to bite. And on the 10th day, God dressed in a blood-red bodysuit, dropped it low, called it a sunset. And on the 11th day, God said, "Girl." And the trees leaned in for gossip. The water went wild with tea. The air tight with shade. And on the 12th day, Jesus wept in the mirror, mourning how his sons would shame his sons for walking the daughter stride, for how his children would learn to hate the kids. And on the 13th day, God barely moved. He sat around dreaming of glitter, happy with the shine of it, but sad. So many of his children would come home covered in it. The parades canceled due to rain of fists and insults and rope and bullets. And on the 14th day, God just didn't know what to do with himself. 2. The Lord begat man. Man begat sin. Sin begat a new joy. A new joy begat Leviticus. Leviticus begat Sister Rosa. Sister Rosa begat that ugly rumor. That ugly rumor begat the truth. The truth begat the need to pray or run. The need to pray or run begat the knees, and that's a kind of praying too. The knees begat the mouth, splattered all over the in-colored dirt road. The mouth splattered all over the in-colored dirt road still begat a song. The song begat a hymn. At the sweet boy's funeral, the sweet boy's funeral still begat his aunt's disgusted headshake. His aunt's disgusted headshake begat the world that killed the girl child and stole her favorite dress off her cold, shimmering body, and that can't come from God, right? 3, a not him for her. I am on the battlefield for my Lord, for my Lord. I am the battlefield, my Lord. And I promise him that I die, I battle my Lord.
Okay, so everybody ready? Good? Okay. All right, and so Danez, and I'll start take a side note to say, right, that this is perhaps my favorite poem that Danez Smith does. But it's also, they didn't tell me it's their favorite, but I think it's their favorite. And the reason why I say that is because they've said that they almost always start a poetry set when they're invited, that this is almost always the first poem that they do, right? And so the first thing, of course, is that Smith queers the creation narrative through the retelling of Genesis, hence the poem's title, right? In this poem, throughout, right, they engage with the idea of silence to transform the meaning of the hymn, right? Engaging the body as a site of spiritual, sexual, and gendered expression while deliberately exploring the power of voice and the pain of that silence, right? Smith engages here in what Kelly Brown Douglas would call a black sexual discourse of resistance by explicitly addressing the responsibility of fundamentalist religious views and the churches who advance them for the destruction of the poem's queer subject, right? So while the title Genesis suggests an emphasis on a feminized queer male identity, the poem itself is not limited in this regard. Rather, Genesis engages black gay male identity both literally and figuratively, while also addressing gender identity and expression through a direct address to trans figures. Smith begins the poem with an invocation to the fallen, right? Two black transgender women, Dwayne Gully Queen Jones and Islan Nettles, who, quote, lost their lives at the hands of their own communities, right? And so immediately he presses the audience to examine who is a part of the community, right? Who is their own community, right? And so there's a way that the invocation, right, to these two black trans women is automatically about thinking about those who exist at the margins of the margins, right? By thinking about black trans women who are arguably at most risk for violent crimes, right? At most risk for erasure, at most risk for, violation, right? To think about how we can start the narrative of the origins of everything by first focusing on the people who get the least amount of attention, right? And so, okay, no, see, now I've lost myself. All right. Okay, even still, right, Smith's effort to address the conditions of trans women is well situated within the testimonial tradition. Smith reflects upon the inclusion of autobiographical elements of their work, saying, quote, even more of the third-party stuff I think about as self-sourced. So even if it's not necessarily my story that I'm testifying on, it's still testifying the act of witness. I think witness can be a kind of testimony. End quote. And so while Smith recognizes that it is, quote, very dangerous to try to speak for a community, right, they do argue, I feel an urgency to talk about things that relate to black and queer and trans communities because of those communities in which my body exists, end quote. Right? And so I look at, even though he is kind of bearing witness and not saying this is this thing that happened to me, right? I look at this as a part of the testimonial tradition because I think it's important that Smith is incorporating multiple realities into their own testimony, functioning in service to the larger queer community, right? Does this make sense? Yeah? Okay, and so Smith is reframing biblical text in order to speak to contemporary political realities, offering correctives to church-based communities by revisiting the supposed source of their beliefs and condemnations. As they acknowledge in another recent interview, quote, one of my favorite things to do is to play with the Bible, to put God in gay situations. He's everywhere. I think I'm a failed comedian, so sometimes I try to use humor to talk about more difficult subjects, especially things that are in the midst of grieving. So, end quote, right? So I argue then that Smith is engaged in a time-honored tradition of black biblical hermeneutics and interpretation, whereby the interpretation and exploration of biblical themes and figures has been tailored to the experiences of black people, right? Smith's poetry certainly gestures toward an investment in queer liberation theology, but it's important to note its indebtedness to a long tradition of disruptive biblical interpretation, including black liberation theology and womanist theology, formalized by figures such as James Cone and Katie Cannon, but also practiced in pulpits across the country, right? Even though, again, he's queering this, he's not doing anything that's really not done in pulpits across the country where we take these biblical narratives and place them into contemporary context, right? Beyond the church space, I look at Smith as following in the footsteps of figures like Zora Neale Hurston, of Langston Hughes, right, who writes lynching poetry by casting it as a narrative of the crucifixion. Of course, I look at James Baldwin. I look at figures like the recently deceased Gloria Naylor to think about how what Danez is doing fits right in line with a long, long tradition of black artists who have taken biblical narratives and reappropriated them in order to make some comment about the contemporary moment in which they exist, right? And so while I look at all of these, there's one poem in particular that this kind of jumps out at me as bearing important parallels to, which is, of course, The Creation by James Weldon Johnson, right? We're familiar with The Creation, long held, practiced in most Black History Month celebrations in church, and God stepped out on space and said, I'm lonely, I'll make me a world, right? And so there's a way that what Johnson does in 1917, right, is very similar to what Danez is doing now, right? Where Johnson starts off and darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp, right? That idea of locating blackness at the origin of everything, the idea of taking God and putting black vernacular in their mouth, comparing God to a mammy bending over her baby, right? I mean, this is transgressive stuff that Johnson is doing in 1917, and I would argue that in the 21st century, Danez is very much following suit, right? He creates an original atmosphere of queerness by introducing a world with the first snap and the hand's humble attempt at thunder. The trees lean in for gossip, the water goes wild with tea, the air tight with shade. He queers God's language with the first words being, quote, let there be fierce, and prominently and emphatically incorporates dialogue such as girl. The framing of the creator's speech through queer colloquiums bears significant power. Again, given the revision of a narrative where God speaks the world into being with the command, let there be light. Smith emphasizes the importance of origins by revisiting the root of the creative power of utterance and the foundation of testimony itself. Beyond the speech acts, Smith provides physical manifestations of queerness within a reimagined Garden of Eden, right? When he's talking about God in a blood-red bodysuit, dropping it low, calling it a sunset, right? He troubles the potentially heteronormative pairing of Adam and Eve by queering both figures, right? Where Adam is learning to duck walk, dip, pose, death drop. Eve is, instead of Eve succumbing to the temptation, right, she embodies that temptation by, saying, looked the lion in the eye and dared the king to bite, right? Adam is moving with theatrical pride, and they're both following this kind of ostentatiously queer example of God in this blood-red bodysuit, right? And so there's a way that what Smith is doing is queering every single figure that's there in the Garden of Eden and doing it, I think, brilliantly, and perhaps I'm a little biased, right? And so Smith is centering the queer community then within the creation narrative in a way that the creator is also invested in their existence and in their continued survival, right? Also, by beginning the poem on the 8th day, Smith posits the introduction of queerness as the true fulfillment of God's initial mission to create, suggesting that the Lord's work had not yet been completed after the first 7 days, or with the creation of mankind. The fact that the poem's opening section concludes on the 12th day, where Jesus wept in the mirror, mourning how his sons would shame his sons for walking a daughter's stride, right? For how his children would learn to hate the kids. While Smith continues to present all of humanity as God's children, the distinctions drawn between sons and daughters, as well as the children and the kids, reveals a God betrayed by his creation. The image of Jesus weeping in the mirror reflects the vision of a fractured community that has turned their backs on each other and therefore turned their backs on him, right? And so I'll also point out, right, that this is a very interesting thing, right, that we're starting on the 8th day, right, and then by the 12th day, Jesus, well, first of all, we're already gone from God to Jesus, and he's already weeping in a mirror, right? So there's a way in which, Danez is playing with the timeline in a very important ways, right? And so the sadness then gives way to the moment where the creator's movements cease, not for rest as in the traditional narrative, but out of a sense of exhaustion. It is on the 13th day, the poem's respective 6th rather than 7th, that God barely moved, right? Here, it presumably takes mankind even fewer days to destroy the world than it took the creator to set it into motion. In Smith's vision, the 14th day presents an utterly broken-hearted deity who just didn't know what to do with himself, disappointed by his children's destructive exercise of free will. As the first section of the poem concludes, the queer body is unashamed and instead glorifies in color and shine. Nor is there a sense of queer voices being silenced out of the fear of confession, but the deity is left broken-hearted by those presumably straight children who refuse to accept their queer siblings as their own. All right. Now I'm on to part 2. Furthering the indictment of any church-based community that would prefer its queer voices silent, the second stanza moves beyond the moment of creation to explore the evolution of biblical narrative, and along with it biblically infused, biblically justified condemnation. Appropriating the biblical language of lineage, Smith reimagines genealogy. The Lord begat man. Man begat sin. Sin begat a new joy. A new joy begat Leviticus. Leviticus begat Sister Rosa. Sister Rosa begat that ugly rumor The ugly rumor begat the truth. Within this progression, it is clear that man is responsible for the creation of sin, and therefore bears responsibility for the consequences of that which is deemed sinful. Smith argues that Sister Rosa's judgment, supposedly rooted in Leviticus, must be recognized as having more mundane origins. This is key, again, for understanding the necessary distinction between a testimony of burden, which seeks to confess a sin and request deliverance, and a testimony which is rooted in celebration of one's personal identity rather than shame. In Smith's rendering, confession is not necessary to dismiss rumor or to confirm the truth of one's queerness. There is no need to confess sinfulness of one's flesh in order to gain access to the joy of the Lord here, as both sin and joy are constructed not by God but by man. As such, Smith once again advances the necessity of testimony as part of a sexual discourse of resistance. By rewriting the narrative of guilt and responsibility, Smith also not only challenges the expectation for confession, but also the narrative of struggle, and asks the audience to reimagine the role that silence plays within it. Smith introduces acts of violence interspersed with acts of worship, presented through prayers as well as hymns, right? As Smith's own voice speaks with a heightened level of urgency and grief, the lineage continues. The truth begat the need to pray or run, the need to pray or run begat the knees, and that's a kind of praying too. The knees begat the mouth, splattered all over the hymn-colored dirt road. The mouth, splattered all over the hymn-colored dirt road, still begat a song. The song begat a hymn at the sweet boy's funeral. Paralleling acts of supplication with homophobic and transphobic violence, the poem begs its audience to question the relationship between hateful actions and the systems of belief that drive them, to challenge fundamentalist ideologies and instead venerate the sweet children whose lives are sacrificed on the altar of religious belief. Smith's presentation of voice through prayer as well as song continues to feature prominently, mirroring the violence that destroys the queer subject's mouth, effectively silencing them. Having been beaten down first by rumors and disapproval, they are then subjected to a total disavowal of their humanity by being funeralized as a boy rather than the girl's identity that they had claimed as their own. The emphasis that Smith places on the subject's broken body is also telling as this section of the poem reaches its conclusion. The family's rejection of the deceased's gender identity is made manifest through his aunt's disgusted headshake, which begat the world that killed the girl child and stole her favorite dress off her cold, shimmering body. The brokenness of Smith's queer subject is complete, as they are left both mouthless and abjected by their nudity. The damage to the body and the denial of voice parallels the multi-layered queering of the divine creator in part 1, yet the gender fluidity here is key. Smith presents God as male throughout the use of pronouns, but that masculinity is disrupted by the introduction of traditionally feminized speech and by cloaking God in a blood-red bodysuit. Here, in part 2, the sweet boy is articulated as a girl child and referred to by feminine pronouns only after the dirt road is splattered with the remnants of the mouth that belonged to him, and only after her favorite dress had been stolen off of her body, which still shimmered, perhaps even with the same glitter that had so captivated God in part 1. In this chilling final moment, the body is fully reduced to spectacle in the stillness of death, with Smith's skillful use of cold, shimmering imagery rather than the cold, shivering movement of a body that is still alive. As the audience is confronted with the imagery of her broken, though still brilliantly shining body, Smith concludes with the interrogative, and that can't come from God, right? Smith's question, posed in tearful exasperation, is thoughtfully framed in reference not to the body of the girl child. To do so would run the risk of echoing the condemnation of restrictive church communities, which far too frequently dismiss queer bodies as abominations. Rather, the that, which couldn't possibly come from God, refers back to the last object which has been begotten within the poem's lineage, the world that killed the girl child. By so doing, Smith is deliberate in suggesting that though the girl child lost her life in the previous stanza's struggle, it is the world, a phrasing that in and of itself challenges a church that sees itself as sacredly and dichotomously opposed to the secular trappings of, quote, the world. It is the world that requires deliverance in order to return to the path of righteousness and the favor of God. As Smith concludes Genealogy, Part 3 combines the poem's interest in queer identity alongside depictions of voice, silence, and song. Smith reclaims the voice of the silenced queer subject while echoing the interrogation of gender binaries by presenting a, quote, not him for her, a reimagining of the traditional hymn, I am on the battlefield for my Lord. Through musical pauses and lyrical gaps, the traditional refrain morphs, adding new meaning for the queer voices that are represented. Though the opponent of Black queer subjectivity has often been presented as God himself, Smith complicates that through the poem, troubling the construction through the exploration of the community that begat life-claiming violence based on supposed faith in God. Here, in the poem's final lines, the I might be imagined to be at battle with my Lord. Yet the unanswered question at the end of part 2 lingers. If indeed that can't come from God, right? Then the question of who and what is truly at the heart of this battle continues, even as Smith steps quietly away from the microphone. Now, Genealogy is left purposefully without a point of closure, right? Smith addresses the battle far more conclusively elsewhere. Among Smith's earliest works was a one-man theater production for those who pray in closets, The Problem with Sundays. In this play, the central character, Isaiah, is a 22-year-old, quote, quiet church boy who listens to his mother and does what he can to spread the word of God by day, as well as, quote, a budding drag princess, bending gender and working that thing as fiercely as he tries to hide his relationship with the pastor's son after the sun goes down. As the narrative unfolds, Isaiah finds himself at a standstill, having to choose between his religion and his sexuality, his God and his lover, his saint and his sin. Eventually, Isaiah is led to the personal declaration, I have no sickness or condition. There is no cure. I am nothing but life. God named me like everything else, right? Again, echoing the creation narrative. God named me like everything else. I was not to be subject to your spit or your fire or fences, fists, faggots, fairies, your fantasies that you attempt to beat out of me or to get me to beat it out of myself. I am no demon. I was born to be happy. Can't you see my beauty? Can't you see my gorgeous? Can't you see my humanity before it's rejected and pushed into closets cramped with empty men looking to be filled? I am no demon. I am not evil. I am not. End quote. Within the play, Smith offers evidence of the potentially liberating impact of resistant vernacular performances, which allow a queered subject to refute charges of inferiority or sinfulness, often rooted in the power of their personal testimony. For Smith, the conflict with restrictive church spaces in their youth likewise yields an important self-conception and self-articulation in adulthood, which allows for an engagement with spirituality and sexuality as part of a cohesive identity. As Smith expresses in another interview with Lambda Literary in 2015, quote, today, being Black and gay is an armor, a gospel I love dearly. I love Black queers. I love who and how we are. It's taught me a lot about love, how it can surprise you with its leaps and failures. It's taught me a lot about masks, where they reign and where they crumble. It feels so good to finally be me, after so many years of denying that, trying to pray what was God-given away, end quote. Yet, like any good testimony, the relationship between an individual and their community is paramount. Smith is not content to secure their own liberation while leaving those other hushed choir boys behind. The declarative and celebratory testimonies of characters such as Isaiah or of Danez themselves, right, are not possible without the questions first posited in works such as Genealogy, wherein Danez Smith, again, along with others that are emerging within spoken word communities, introduces unabashedly queer subjects who are prepared to interrogate the traditional standards through which their identities have been restricted. In so doing, Smith endeavors to establish spaces where Black queer voices, narratives, and lives receive both attention and affirmation, refuting the desire of any institution to render them voiceless, marginalized, or contained within narrowly defined representations of their identities. Black queer poetic testimonies, as contemporary manifestations of vernacular resistance, shatter the silence that would otherwise cost them their lives. In so doing, the act of testimony brings forth the reclamation of self and spirit that ensures their survival, making it possible for those who follow in their footsteps to do the same. Thank you.